Welcome. Thanks for joining me. In the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about systems of spelling, standardization, and borrowing in the early modern period. So let's get started. I want to first turn to this issue of paleography. This isn't a topic often brought up in history of the English language classes, but it's fascinating to me. But, I'm weird. And it's a hot topic in early modern studies right now, so let's take a few moments to consider it. So paleography is the study of ancient or not so ancient writing systems and the deciphering and dating of historical manuscripts. In early modern studies, this translates to learning how to read Elizabethan era handwriting, and that's not easy. Those who study paleography are the ones who discovered the difference in parchment types during the early modern period and other basics of how and why people wrote at that time. There are still scribes working in the 16th century in England, and their handwriting style influenced the handwritings of others, less educated people. And so secretary script was a handwriting style that emerged in this period. It was a more legible alternative to both Gothic hand and Insular script. And there's some examples of secretary script in the course media folder for this week. So check that out when you get a chance. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, the printing press started to standardize spelling in the late 15th century. By the late 16th century, however, there were groups of schoolmasters and educated gentlemen who found fault with the systems in place. Many of them wanted to make English spelling phonetic so that it would be easier for everyone to spell better. They even went so far as suggesting that the Latin alphabet be abandoned and a new one developed. Yeah, that didn't work, but, they tried. Richard Mulcaster, one of the spelling reformers, advocated for consistency in spelling. And in other words, he wanted a more intuitive spelling system that people could learn by analogy. Mulcaster would serve as an inspiration for language reformers for years to come. By the mid-17th century, however, it seemed that these reformers lost the battle. The standardization that started with the printing press was confirmed with the repeated printing of text. So text kept being repeated, and so the standard just kind of became set. But here's the exception. Not all people who knew how to write knew how to spell. Right? And so we see inconsistencies in spelling in private documents and letters throughout the 19th century. And in fact, if we're being honest, that probably continues today, right? I once had a kindergarten. My first name is Roxy. She spelt my name Rocksee. And I'm like, well, you're not wrong. So things like spell check has done much to help maintain the standardization of typed manuscripts. So some people wanted to spell everything the way it sounds, kind of like my name, and that makes sense. However, other people wanted to spell words according to their origins, which may be less intuitive, right? So we have this struggle happening right now. This is also how we see the proposal of etymological spellings, and this is also how we see etymological misspellings of words like debt and doubt. Both of them came into the English without a B. Okay, because that's how they were spelled in the original language of French. However, some scholars assume that those words were taken from Latin and added the B's to make those words look more like their Latin cognates. Another effect of all these respellings is that people would change their pronunciation of a word to fit the spelling. So comptroller was suddenly spelled with a P to connect it to French. So when comptroller was suddenly spelled with a P, people started pronouncing it as comptroller, not controller, as it was originally pronounced. Let's talk for a second about solecisms that lingers from this period. And a solecism is just another word for error. When we see dramatizations of the early modern period, whether in film or at so-called Renaissance fairs, an image that should come to your mind is the signs hanging above shops that advertise, Yale Blacksmith or Yale Tavern. If you'll remember from a previous lecture, ye, Y-E, was a form of address for a social superior. Why would we then substitute ye for thee? I don't know. This goes back actually to early methods of printing. Of course, it always goes back to printing. The old English letter thorn was still used in English manuscripts, and thorn made a TH sound, so it would have been used in place of the letters T and H. However, printers got their type fonts from the continents. And thorn was not used in the continent, or on the continent, sorry. The closest thing to thorn was Y. And so printers would write Y-E instead of T-H-E with the thorn. The E was superscript, so here. And that was to let readers know that the word was an abbreviation for T-H-E and not Y-E, the second personal pronoun. So Y superscript E was still pronounced thee. The modern pronunciation and use of Y-E for thee complete solecism or error. Continuing, English continues to borrow from European languages during the early modern period, but we see Latin making more contributions to French than French or other continental languages. The advent of easier, more affordable travel meant that more people could visit other countries and bring back loan words with them. At this time, we also see the creation of new words by adding Latin affixes like A-T-I-O-N, ation. So adaptation and adoration are two examples of new words created by Latin additions. The beginning of the early modern period coincides with the English Renaissance, which means rebirth. Most people think of the Renaissance as a great period of artistic and literary production, which is true, but it's also a renewal of interest in individuality through education, invention, and self-discovery. More lay people were reading books than ever before, and we see this lead to a growing number of books published in English. There are some topics usually discussed in Latin, though, like science and medicine. So when a writer wanted to treat these topics in English, so when someone wanted to talk about science or medicine, those topics were originally discussed in Latin. So what the writers would do is borrow words from Latin or invent new words to meet their needs. And this was called inkhorn terms. To be more specific, inkhorn terms are unusual, uncommon words based in classical languages that made authors sound pedantic. This use of Latin words could be seen by some as making English more dignified, but a surprising number of people reacted negatively to this literary showboating. They found these words to be pretentious or snobbish and thought English writers should just use English words. It's an early type of literary nationalism. So while we see some writers arguing about whether or not to use words from other languages, which they were already doing, whether they realized it or not, others like Edmund Spenser and the so-called Scottish Chaucerians were making their language appear closer to Middle English or Old English to add to the prestige of the origins of the language. And so all of these spellings and changes and differences to the lexicon prompted the publication of early grammars here. And grammars were just guidelines for using a language. These early English grammars were intended to help people learn to speak English, but only later would we see grammars for native peoples or native speakers. We also see grammars appearing in England for other languages so that educated people could learn to speak Italian and Spanish in addition to English and Latin. So we're talking about the way words sounded in this period, but we obviously don't have audio recordings. So how do we know? How do we know what the words sounded like? I've mentioned a few times that not all people who knew how to write knew how to spell. Well, that's gonna play into how we know how things sounded. Whenever we see misspellings in private correspondence, so private letters, we assume that the writer was transcribing the word phonetically, and that gives us an idea as to how a specific social group would have said a word. This, of course, doesn't extend to all of society, and perhaps those from lower social ranks would have spoken slightly differently, but we don't have as many existing records from that particular group. One of the things we learn about pronunciation in this time, for example, is that many English words we now spell with TH were originally pronounced with a hard T, right? So, for example, as we pronounce Sir Anthony Hopkins' name, Anthony, not Anthony. Okay, this historical mispronunciation was applied to many words due to etymological respellings. Whew, okay, thanks for listening. If you have any questions about this lecture, I know it was a lot. I know there was a lot about misspellings and a lot about even though you could write, you couldn't spell, and that affected everything from spelling to word choice to things like that. Just keep in mind you can listen to this lecture again and again if need be. And as always, email me if you have any questions. Have a good day.